The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine suburban street as Margaret Henderson, armed with her clipboard and years of self-appointed authority, marched toward what she believed would be another routine HOA violation enforcement. Her heels clicked against the sidewalk with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her 47 years of neighborhood policing. The target of her mission stood innocently in the distance, a beautiful cedar fence that had appeared seemingly overnight, surrounding a property that had been the subject of whispered conversations at every HOA meeting for the past 6 months. What Margaret didn't realize as she approached the modest two-story home at 1247 Maple Drive was that she was about to encounter someone who would shatter everything she thought she knew about power, property rights, and the very foundation upon which her iron-fisted rule over Willowbrook Estates had been built. The clipboard in her hands contained what she believed to be an ironclad violation notice, but hidden in a dusty filing cabinet across town lay documents that would turn her world completely upside down. The fence itself was a thing of beauty, feet of perfectly stained cedar planks that seemed to mock every HOA regulation Margaret had memorized by heart. It had appeared 3 days ago, erected by a crew of workers who had ignored her shouted demands to see their permits. Now, she was here to deliver what she considered justice, completely unaware that she was walking into a confrontation that would expose the most shocking secret in Willowbrook Estate's 15-year history. As she reached the front gate, her fingers already dialing the number for code enforcement on her phone, Margaret had no idea that the quiet homeowner inside was about to reveal a truth so devastating that it would not only end her reign of terror but completely transform the entire neighborhood's understanding of who really held the power in their little slice of suburban paradise. For Margaret Henderson, this wasn't just about a fence, it was about maintaining the iron grip of control that had defined her existence for over a decade. As the self-proclaimed guardian of Willowbrook Estate's property values and aesthetic standards, she had built her entire identity around being the neighborhood's ultimate authority. Every perfectly manicured lawn, every regulation-compliant mailbox, every approved paint color stood as a testament to her unwavering vigilance. The appearance of this unauthorized fence represented more than a simple violation. It was a direct challenge to everything she had worked to build. The emotional stakes couldn't have been higher for Margaret. Her position as HOA president wasn't just a title, it was her entire social standing, her sense of purpose, and her primary source of validation. She had sacrificed friendships, alienated family members, and devoted countless hours to maintaining what she saw as order and civilization in their community. The thought of being challenged, of appearing weak or ineffective in front of the neighbors who both feared and respected her authority, sent waves of panic through her perfectly composed exterior. But Margaret wasn't the only one with something to lose. The homeowner behind that beautiful cedar fence, David Chen, had invested everything both financially and emotionally into what he believed would be his peaceful retirement haven. After 30 years of military service and another decade in corporate consulting, he had purchased the property with dreams of finally creating a private sanctuary where he could tend his garden, work on his vintage car restoration projects, and enjoy the quiet solitude he had earned through decades of service to others. The stakes extended far beyond just two individuals. Every resident of Willowbrook Estates had grown accustomed to Margaret's rule, some grateful for the maintained property values, others resentful of the constant scrutiny and endless list of regulations. The outcome of this confrontation would determine whether the neighborhood would continue under Margaret's authoritarian control or potentially enter a new era of property rights and personal freedom. What made the stakes even more critical was the financial element lurking beneath the surface. Margaret's violation notice carried with it daily fines that could quickly escalate into thousands of dollars, potentially forcing David to remove his fence or face legal action. For a retiree on a fixed income, such fines represented a genuine threat to his financial security and his ability to remain in the home he had worked so hard to acquire. Just as Margaret raised her hand to knock on David's front door, her phone buzzed with a text message that made her blood run cold. It was from Jennifer Walsh, her closest ally on the HOA board and fellow enforcer of neighborhood standards. Emergency board meeting tonight. Someone's been asking questions about the original property deeds. We need to talk. Margaret's confident stride faltered for the first time in years. Questions about property deeds? In her decade-plus tenure as HOA president, no one had ever challenged the fundamental structure of their community association. She had always operated under the assumption that the neighborhood's original developer had properly established the HOA's authority over all properties within Willowbrook Estates. The thought that someone might be digging into the legal foundations of her power sent an unfamiliar chill down her spine. But Margaret Henderson hadn't reached her position by backing down from challenges. If anything, this new development only strengthened her resolve to deal with the fence situation swiftly and decisively. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her grip on the clipboard, and pressed the doorbell with the force of someone who had never encountered a problem she couldn't solve through sheer determination and regulatory authority. The door opened to reveal David Chen, A man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of calm, measured demeanor that comes from years of handling high-pressure situations. He was dressed in a simple flannel shirt and jeans, dirt still visible under his fingernails from his morning gardening work. His expression was neither hostile nor welcoming, just pleasantly neutral, as if he had been expecting this visit. "Mr. Chen, I presume?" Margaret's voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "I'm Margaret Henderson, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I'm here regarding the unauthorized fence you've erected around your property." David's response was not what she expected. Instead of the usual stammering apologies or defensive explanations she was accustomed to receiving, he simply smiled, a knowing expression that seemed to suggest he had been looking forward to this conversation far more than she had. "Mrs. Henderson," David said, his voice carrying a warmth that somehow made Margaret even more uncomfortable than outright hostility would have. "I've been wondering when you'd come by. Please, would you like to come in for coffee? I think we have quite a bit to discuss about property rights and authority in this neighborhood." The invitation itself was unprecedented. In Margaret's experience, HOA violations were handled on doorsteps, with homeowners either immediately acquiescing to her demands or launching into futile arguments about the unfairness of the regulations. Never had anyone invited her inside for coffee, and certainly never with the kind of confident smile that suggested they knew something she didn't. Against her better judgment, Margaret found herself accepting the invitation. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe the subtle but unmistakable air of authority that David projected, something that reminded her uncomfortably of her own demeanor when dealing with neighborhood violations. As she stepped into his living room, she noticed something that made her clipboard tremble slightly in her hands. The walls were covered with framed documents, certificates, and what appeared to be legal papers. But it wasn't just the quantity of official-looking paperwork that caught her attention. It was the prominent display of what looked like property surveys, deed transfers, and municipal planning documents. For someone who had supposedly just moved into the neighborhood 6 months ago, David Chen seemed to have an unusual interest in local property law and municipal regulations. "You seem surprised by my collection," David observed, following her gaze to the documents. "I suppose I should explain? You see, Mrs. Henderson, before I moved into this house, I spent considerable time researching the history of Willowbrook Estates. It's fascinating what you can discover when you dig deep enough into public records." Margaret's mouth went dry. The confidence she had carried into this confrontation was rapidly evaporating, replaced by a growing sense that she was walking into a trap she couldn't yet identify. The text message from Jennifer Walsh suddenly took on new significance. Someone had been asking questions about original property deeds, and that someone was apparently the quiet homeowner she had assumed would be an easy target for HOA enforcement. "Now then," David continued, settling into his chair with the ease of someone completely in control of the situation, "shall we discuss this fence violation? Or would you prefer to start with the more fundamental question of whether the Willowbrook Estates HOA has any legal authority over my property at all?" Margaret's clipboard clattered to the floor as David's words hit her like a physical blow. "What do you mean, no legal authority?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible above the sudden roaring in her ears. David stood and walked to one of the framed documents on his wall, removing it with the careful precision of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. "Mrs. Henderson, meet the original master deed for the entire Willowbrook Estates development, filed with the county clerk's office in 2008. He handed her the document, his expression remaining kind but unmistakably triumphant. As Margaret's eyes scanned the legal language, her world began to crumble. The document clearly stated that while the developer had created an HOA structure for the majority of the neighborhood, one property, 1247 Maple Drive, had been explicitly excluded from all homeowners association covenants, restrictions, and regulations. The reason, buried in legal terminology, was that the property had been purchased by the developer's business partner as a personal residence, with the express understanding that it would remain free from HOA oversight. But that's impossible," Margaret stammered, her voice rising with desperation. "You can't just opt out of an HOA. There are regulations, there are property values to maintain. There are legal documents that supersede your personal preferences," David interrupted gently but firmly, "and I'm afraid there's more you need to know." He walked to his desk and pulled out a thick folder that looked as though it had been meticulously organized for this exact conversation. "You see, Mrs. Henderson, when I decided to purchase this property, I didn't just buy a house. I bought it from the estate of the original developer's business partner, which means I inherited all of the rights and privileges that came with that original agreement." Margaret sank into the nearest chair, her mind racing as she tried to process the implications of what she was hearing. You're saying your property isn't part of the Not only is my property not subject to HOA regulations," David continued, his voice taking on a tone of quiet authority that Margaret was beginning to recognize, "but according to these documents, the original agreement gave this property owner now me certain oversight privileges regarding the HOA's activities, particularly when they relate to municipal compliance and property law violations." The room seemed to spin around Margaret as the full weight of the revelation crashed down upon her. For over a decade, she had been operating under the assumption that her authority was absolute within Willowbrook Estates. She had fined residents, forced property modifications, and wielded her power with the confidence of someone who believed the law was on her side. Now, she was discovering that not only did she have no authority over the one property she had targeted, but that property's owner might actually have authority over her. "Who are you?" she whispered, finally asking the question that should have been her first inquiry months ago when David had moved into the neighborhood. David's smile was answer enough, but he provided the details anyway. "I'm a retired municipal attorney who spent 30 years specializing in property law and HOA regulations. When I decided to find a peaceful place to retire, I made sure to choose a property where I could avoid exactly the kind of overreach I spent decades fighting in court." The sound of Margaret's world collapsing was almost audible in the sudden silence that filled the room. Every violation notice she had ever issued, every fine she had imposed, every regulation she had enforced would now be subject to scrutiny by someone who understood property law better than she had ever bothered to learn. 3 weeks later, the transformed landscape of Willowbrook Estates told the story of how quickly absolute power could crumble when confronted with actual legal authority. Margaret Henderson's resignation letter had been brief and bitter, submitted to a hastily convened HOA board meeting where David Chen appeared as an observer, his legal right as the holder of oversight privileges granted by the original development agreement. The beautiful cedar fence still stood proudly around David's property, but it was no longer the subject of neighborhood controversy. Instead, it had become a symbol of something many residents had never thought possible: the successful challenge of unchecked HOA authority. Word had spread quickly through the community about the confrontation, and with it came a wave of questions from homeowners who had long suffered under Margaret's rigid enforcement of often arbitrary regulations. David had not sought to become a neighborhood hero, but his quiet expertise in property law had provided something invaluable to his fellow residents: hope. Several homeowners had approached him for advice regarding violations they had received, and in more than one case, he had been able to demonstrate that the HOA's actions exceeded their legal authority. The organization that Margaret had wielded like a weapon was being transformed into something more collaborative and legally compliant. The emergency board meeting that Jennifer Walsh had texted about had, indeed, taken place, but not in the way Margaret had anticipated. Instead of rallying support for her position, the meeting had devolved into a frank discussion about the need for new leadership and a comprehensive review of the HOA's practices. David had been invited to serve as a consultant, helping to ensure that future regulations would be both legally sound and focused on genuine community benefit, rather than arbitrary control. Departure had created a vacuum that was being filled not by another authoritarian figure, but by a more democratic approach to neighborhood governance. The residents who had once whispered their complaints about HOA overreach were now openly participating in discussions about how their community should be managed. As David worked in his garden each morning, tending to the vegetables and flowers that grew behind his legally unassailable fence, he reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought him to this point. He had sought only peace and privacy in his retirement, but had instead found himself serving as an unlikely champion for property rights and reasonable community governance. The story of the fence that had started as a simple boundary marker had become something much more significant, a reminder that true authority comes not from the power to control others, but from the knowledge to stand up for what is legally and morally right. In challenging Margaret's assumed authority, David had not only protected his own property rights, but had inadvertently liberated an entire neighborhood from the tyranny of unchecked HOA power. The morning sun still cast long shadows across the pristine suburban street, but now those shadows fell across a community where homeowners could tend their gardens, maintain their properties, and live their lives with the confidence that their rights would be respected and their voices would be heard. And at the center of it all stood a beautiful cedar fence, no longer a symbol of defiance, but a testament to the power of knowledge, preparation, and the quiet courage to stand up for what is right.